Hello and welcome everyone to our webinar today about youth employment in Niagara. My name is Sarah Webster. I'm a knowledge broker with Niagara Connect, and also supporting this event today is one of our other team members, Sarah Johnston, who's acting as chairperson in the meeting room, as well as our executive director, Mary Wiley. And Niagara Connect is excited to offer this webinar in partnership with the Niagara Community Observatory at Brock University. And today we've got presenters Dr. Charles Conta, Dr. Carol Phillips, and Jeff Boggs, who will be sharing with us their findings from their latest policy brief entitled Youth Employment in Niagara, Mapping the Opportunities. For those of you who haven't joined us yet on a webinar before, I'll give you a quick orientation. The audio, as you can hear me, is coming through the phone line today. We do mute all of our participant lines during the presentation part of our call, and this just allows us to cut down on the inevitable background noise of dogs barking and fire alarms going off, but also allows those people who are joining in groups together to still have any sidebar conversations without interrupting any of the presentation itself. We do also record all of our webinars, and we'll post that recording on the Niagara Knowledge Exchange within about a week. And we'll also send you a follow-up resource package. So you'll get an email from us sometime next week, and that'll include a link to the recording, a PDF of the slides, and the policy brief itself. And we encourage you to share that with other colleagues of yours who may not be able to join us today. If you have any questions or comments during the presentation, you can use the chat pod down the left-hand side of your screen in the online meeting room. And if it's something technology related, Sarah Johnston will help you in the moment. And if not, we'll just flag the questions and we'll save them for our discussion period at the end of the presentation. So we'll allow about 15, 20 minutes at the end to be able to answer any questions that you might have. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Charles to get us started and take us away.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, for that wonderful introduction and for sort of laying out the context for today's presentation and discussion. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today in this exciting topic of youth employment in Niagara. So essentially, as Sarah said, what I'll be doing is providing the introduction or kind of laying the groundwork, if you will, and then my colleague, Carol, will step in and give you kind of a run-through or walk through the data and our findings. And then our colleague, Jeff Boggs, who's also a research associate with the NCO and a partner in this project, will lead sort of the Q&A session in which we solicit your feedback and your input as we take our next steps in our research journey. So what I want to do right now is basically give you a sense of where this project is coming from, and in doing so, I want to acknowledge the funders of the project, especially the Ontario Trillium Foundation, the OTF, and the Niagara Community Foundation. We also have other funders of this project, but these two have been principal partners, and I want to acknowledge and thank them for their support and for their confidence in us and for coming alongside us. I also want to note that this project is a byproduct of a larger research project that we have going on with our colleagues across the border in the University of Buffalo in the School of Architecture and Planning. We have a project on binational prosperity initiative. Essentially, what we're doing is trying to imagine a geographically integrated region of Buffalo and Niagara without a border. And when we collaborate across different sectors, say in the life sciences, advanced manufacturing, tourism, agribusiness, and the like, what is the value proposition of doing business together, of integrating our assets together? And that is this research. And a byproduct of that research is looking at our talent pool. And principally for today's conversation, we're looking at our human capital pool and specifically the skill set of our young people within our modern economy. Now, to set the conversation in context, we all know that we've gone through a massive transformation in the very configuration of our economy, from a manufacturing-based to a service-based and a knowledge-driven economy. Now, within that context, certain things are coming to the fore. One is the centrality of intangible assets in the knowledge-driven economy. Now, when we talk about intangible assets, think about tangible assets in terms of your geographical location, your infrastructural composition, your natural resource endowment, and a few other things, essentially your physical assets, if you will. But your intangible assets refer to those support systems, if you will, that would build the capacity, the competitiveness, and the productivity of your economy for the 21st century. So, for instance, we think about your institutional support systems for knowledge generation, mobilization, and application, as an example. And we also think about your human capital base. That is the stock of your human assets with respect to their skill set, their creativity, their entrepreneurship, and the like. How well they're equipped to participate in the modern service-based, knowledge-driven economy. Now, our concern today is to zero down further into that human capital base and look at the stock of our youth, their talent, their skills, and how well, as a region, we're using it. Because you see, to grasp our human capital, to understand the centrality of our human capital will position us to be a resilient region. That is a region that can navigate through the turbulence of economic restructuring that is affecting not just Niagara, but other mid-sized regions around the world. And so our presentation today is asking ourselves, what are the challenges and what are the opportunities of our youth skill set and talent? And as a region, how effectively have we utilized those skill sets? I will turn the presentation over to my colleague, Carol, and she'll walk you through the data, and she'll provide a map or a portrait of the generation of skills in Niagara and the utilization of those skill sets, essentially the mismatch, if you will, between skills generation and utilization in Niagara. Carol.
Okay, thanks, Charles. Now, we've called our brief Mapping the Opportunities because we wanted to share the information we have thus far to paint a picture of the economic landscape in the region. And much of this information can be used for all age groups. But our goal with this research is to start a conversation with you about what questions you need answering to help you do your jobs better. We'll be continuing this project in the new year with Geography Professor Jeff Boggs as our research lead. And he's joined us today as well to listen in and to add some thoughts as we go on. Now, for this particular piece of research, we've defined youth as aged 15 to 29 years old. And that's simply because this is the broadest range used in the literature. We've approached Stats Canada, and there is no set standard, so we figured that was the safest range to go with. Now, as you can see here, this age group accounts for 17.6% of Niagara's population as measured in the 2016 census. And this is a drop in the proportion of youth living in Niagara when compared to 2011. And you'll also see that this proportion of Niagara's population in this age group is lower than that of Ontario. And if you're wondering if there's, if one of these 3 5-year groups is kind of weighing everybody down, they're not. It's pretty much equal across the board. They're all a little bit below the Ontario proportion in each of those 5-year cohorts. So this maps it out for you visually. When you map it out in the Niagara region, you see that youth are mainly concentrated in the urban areas of St. Catharines, Welland, and Niagara Falls, though there are significant densities in Port Colborne, Fort Erie, and the Grimsby-Lincoln area. And what this map shows is the number of youth per square kilometer. Right, this is a geographic density. And I should also add that you can get this brief on our website at brocu.ca/NCO. So if we go through these slides too quickly, you'll be able to see them on our website. On this slide is the highest education level achieved in Niagara by everyone over the age of 15, not just our youth cohort, but everyone over the age of 15. Now, these numbers are from 2011 and from the National Household Survey, and we'll be updating them for our next brief once the 2016 census numbers become available. So as you can see here, 1/5 of our population has not completed high school, although this number, keep in mind, includes students who are still in high school. Now, Niagara is actually faring better than the province at most education levels, except for the numbers of university educated, where we fall below the provincial proportion. And that includes all levels of university education, undergrads, graduates, and specialist training such as medicine and dentistry. So here we take a closer look at the 20 to 24-year-old age group, as this represents the primary post-secondary years and the age at which youth typically transition from school into full-time work. Now, we found here that 8.5%, I call it very few, some people may disagree with that, but 8.5% still need to complete their high school education in the age group of 20 to 24, while 45% of that group had already graduated with some form of post-secondary degree or diploma. Now, those counted as having their high school education or equivalent and not having yet graduated from post-secondary education may actually still be in university or college, so keep that in mind as well, because that also accounts for about 45% of that population. So we looked at what field this group of 20 to 24-year-olds had graduated in, and that was the group that had completed their education. And we found of the 12,000 plus who had completed post-secondary education, it was the health and related fields that was the most popular area of study. That accounted for 16% of this age group. And again, that's of the group that had already graduated. But it was followed very closely by several fields. Right after them came business, management, and public administration, and after that, architecture and engineering and related technologies. And then after that, very closely behind were personal protective and transportation services and social behavioral science and law. And you'll see the bottom three fields of study there were the physical life sciences and technologies, agriculture, natural resources and conservation, and then the math, computer, and information sciences. And actually, the math, computer, and information sciences accounted for less than 2% of this group. So then what we looked at was where these 20 to 24-year-olds were working. Now, there's a change in this group. So this is all the 20 to 24-year-olds, not just the ones who had graduated. So these are also the people who are still in school. And that's something that I think going forward we may want to see if we can get the data on the ones who actually graduated, where they are working a year later perhaps, something like that. There are more than 20,000 in this population who are working. Now, the top two employment sectors for this group was food service and accommodation and retail trade. And together, those two sectors employed 40% of this age group who were working. Now, this is followed, in number 3, by a catch-all category that includes administrative supports and technical supports. And then also following very closely behind this, and there really was very little difference between these groups, was construction, arts, entertainment, and recreation, healthcare and social assistance, manufacturing, other services, and education, in that order, but there was very little difference in the numbers. So while at this stage of our research, again, we did not determine where the graduates were working, we can see the juxtaposition of fields of study and places of work. And we can surmise at this point as a working hypothesis that perhaps youth are not getting the experience they need before heading into the workforce full-time. So the next section of this presentation and of the brief is our industry mapping, which comes from our recent binational prosperity research, in which we investigated opportunities for cross-border economic cooperation. We worked from a database of 98,000 firms across Hamilton, Niagara, and Buffalo, mapping the locations of businesses that fell into one of 5 sectors: advanced manufacturing, agribusiness, goods transportation and warehousing, life sciences, and culture and tourism. We also looked at job numbers using the online tool MC Analyst. Now you'll see here in advanced manufacturing, there are 829 firms located in Niagara, and this is where they are clustered in the region. The hottest spot being St. Catharines. But there are other noticeable hot spots across the region as well. I'm just going to see if I can give you the density and those events. So where it's the hottest, where it's the deepest red, that's where you'll have 9 businesses per square kilometer. That's where it's most clustered. 9 assets per square kilometer. And within this sector, jobs have grown slightly, as you can see in the box right next to it, and are expected to grow into 2021. Now, this is the agribusiness asset map. We identified 1,461 firms in Niagara, and this is how they're dispersed across Niagara. Now, this is actually the only sector of the 5 that shows a decrease in jobs over the past 5 years and continuing into 2021. And I'll get the density ratio for you here. At its hottest spots, because, of course, vineyards and farms are so vast and widespread, at its most dense, you'll get 4 businesses per square kilometer. In goods transportation and warehousing, there are 870 firms identified with a slight increase in jobs since 2010 and forecast to increase slightly over the next 5 years. In life sciences, we identified 411 firms with a slight increase in jobs forecast over the next 5 years. And I should have given the density ratios for the previous slides, but for life sciences, the most dense areas show 6 assets or 6 businesses per square kilometer. Now, the reason I started to give you the density ratios was because of this culture and tourism map. We identified 5,574 firms in Niagara in this sector, which includes food services and accommodation. And this is by far the biggest sector by number of businesses in Niagara. Hence, the density ratio for our map has changed to show that in the densest parts, we'll have 143 businesses per square kilometer. That's in the hottest spots of the map. Again, compared to, for example, to the agribusiness map, which shows 4 assets or firms per square kilometer. So as you can see, this sector also employs more than 3 times the people than the next closest sector. Over 33,000 jobs will exist in this sector, it's estimated, in 2021, and we're currently at around the 33,000 mark. However, the downside, as I know people are thinking, is that we know these jobs tend to be seasonal, part-time, temporary, and minimum wage. So not only were we able to map these sectors across Niagara and compare employment numbers, but we were able to take business locations and map it against transit data and compare transit accessibility. So using data from the region, we were able to pinpoint the average distances between the closest bus stop and firms within a given sector. So here you see the youth cohort map again, but with an overlay of the public transit routes currently existing in the region. So essentially what this table is showing you is that businesses in the life sciences and tourism sectors were the most accessible to transit routes. In both cases, approximately 3/4 of all identified firms in those 2 sectors were within a 400-meter walk to the nearest bus stop. Less than half the firms in advanced manufacturing and goods transportation and warehousing were within 400 meters from the closest bus stop, though this improved to more than half of those businesses being within a half-kilometer walk. Agribusiness, not surprisingly, was the least accessible. 90% of those firms were more than a half kilometer from the nearest bus stop. And that's as far as our comparison went. I can't tell you how far away they were from the nearest bus stop. Some of them will be many kilometers, obviously. If you would like to know more about the technical aspects of this particular transit analysis, please email us your questions after the presentation, and we'll get them to Nicole Ferguson, who was our research assistant for this project and a GIS specialist. And I think I'll hand it back to Charles to round things up for us.
Well, thank you very much, Carol, for giving us the numbers and the maps to sort of demonstrate essentially what is going on. The central story in all of this is that we are not fully using the skills that we're generating. We're not making the most of the talent pool of our young people. And the subject of youth employment is intrinsically multidimensional. For a region such as Niagara, it's a conversation about market efficiencies from the standpoint of leveraging our full human capital. Are we using the skills that we're producing? Are we producing them for other regions? That is a conversation we need to confront and address. It's also a conversation about social solidarity from the standpoint of poverty alleviation and reduction of income inequality. You know, Carol talked about the nature of employment, for instance, in the hospitality sector. Very precarious, part-time, minimum wage, and the like. So essentially, we'll have a conversation about how we can engage, address, or combat poverty and income inequality. It's a conversation about fully leveraging the skill set of our young. And finally, it's an existential conversation from the standpoint of a region's long-term survival and prosperity. How well we retain our young people, how well we convince them to stay within the region, how well we use them, definitely will affect the longevity of the region in terms of our prosperity and in terms of our survival. So once again, think about youth employment as intrinsically multidimensional, whether in terms of market efficiency, social solidarity, or an existential conversation about our very future. And we've set the context. We've provided the juxtaposition between skills generation and utilization of those skills in our economy. We want to pass the conversation over to Jeff to talk about what are the next steps. What we're giving you is a map, it's a layout, but we want to probe deeper into the data to begin to ask questions about why are things the way they are? What can we do differently? But we want you to be part of that conversation, part of that next step in our research. So I'll pass it on to Jeff, and he will lead this next part of the discussion. Jeff.
Thanks, Charles, and thanks, Carol. You've not heard from me yet. I really just want to see what questions people have. So for the next project that we're going to embark on, we want to extend on this. And from our perspective, this was largely kind of an exploratory project to kind of map out both literally and figuratively where the jobs are and what kind of jobs there are that youth seem to be taking based on the available data. So what we would really like to hear, what I would really like to hear, is what questions the audience has that we could then sort of work through to develop sort of the next stage of this project.
I'm going to change to the next slide, which is a poll. So please answer the poll, and we'll be looking at the results very closely so we know what next steps we should be taking. Now, are there any questions? I know we can answer a few questions here. I think, Sarah, you're going to be moderating this, aren't you?
Yeah, and actually, maybe while people are answering that, we did have a question come in, Carol, when you were talking about transit routes. Claire's asked, why were there no transit routes showing to Niagara-on-the-Lake? There is limited transit service running to that municipality.
Right. We used a database provided to us from Niagara region. So that actually would be a question to ask Niagara region.
Tom has asked here, is there any update on U40?
What is U40?
The under 40 initiative. I believe that's the Workforce Planning Board that's taken the lead in the U40 initiative. So, unless Mario is out there and you can take him off mute, I can't answer that question.
Certainly, if there's anyone on the call from Workforce Planning Board or who knows about the U40 initiative that would like to share their thoughts, you can do so by pressing *7 to unmute your line or by typing in the chat pod. Dave has said U40 here. It is part of the 2018 work plan between Niagara Workforce Planning Board and the Niagara region. Thanks so much, Dave, for that. Marie has asked, were Indigenous youth included in this study?
If the data, my understanding, so I was brought in as kind of a technical consultant, so when Nicole would work on particular aspects, if she got stuck, she would come back and ask me some questions, as well as Charles and Carol. And so my understanding is that Nicole's data, my two compatriots here can correct me if I'm wrong, draw on Statistics Canada data. So none of these data were taken from surveys conducted by the NCO. These were all from federal statistics or from federal statistics that had then been massaged by third-party data aggregators.
Right. So our research is really only as good as the data that we receive. If that is an aspect that it's an interesting aspect to look at, if the data is available, that's the thing. If the data is available for Indigenous youth in Niagara, then that's certainly something we can pull out of StatsCan. One of the things we wanted to do from this is once all the 2016 census data is available, we're going to be asking for customized tables, and that might be one that we can see if it's available.
Yeah, so essentially, Mary, what we have here is a data that's inclusive of all residents in Niagara. So we didn't actually sort of target the Indigenous demographic as such, right? But they'll be part of the study to the extent that they are residents of Niagara.
And so what year was the data pulled from then?
Most of this data has been from the 2011 census, the National Household Survey. The data that we're most interested in has not been released yet and won't be released for another couple of weeks.
Okay.
And in fact, the next study that we're undertaking that Jeff will be a part of will be using that data set coming out at the end of this month to probe deeper into the issues that we just raised.
Right.
And of course, the 2016 data set is expected to be much more robust than what we got in 2011.
Mm-hmm. Great. Claire has asked, is there a significant difference between employment trends for youth and employment trends for the regular workforce? Was that part of your study?
Right. Now, the two graphs that we showed that were for the age 20 to 24, I can't speak to that for the general population. However, the asset maps and those employment numbers with the asset maps, that was for the general population. That wasn't just for youth. Much of what we looked at was for the general population, and we tried to pull out some information on specific age groups so we could get an idea of what the trends were there.
And Jean has asked, and this is probably similar to the question about Indigenous youth, but Jean has asked, is data available for Francophone youth in the region?
Once again, the data is inclusive of all residents within the region. We did not target or identify or separate any specific group along linguistic, racial, or ethnic lines. But I imagine that moving forward, that is one thing that we might consider doing, to be able to sort of identify, if you will, and isolate these different dimensions of the demographic and see if they tell different stories about youth employment.
Right.
So I can imagine that, sort of recalling Stats Canada data, given we should be able to pull out at least numbers of Francophone youth or youth that live in French-speaking households. And then even for Indigenous youth, we should be able to pull that out as well. The problem starts to come in when you want to then when you want to compare that data with things like education levels. So if the education data aren't also tagged for Indigenous status or for Francophone status, then that makes the analysis a bit more difficult. But with custom tabulations with Statistics Canada, in theory, we should be able to pull those up. But whether we can or not depends upon basically whether Stats Canada will cough up the data and how much it costs. I mean, through the university, we may be able, through a system called CHAS, which is part of the University of Toronto, we may be able to pull up that data as well, but we'd have to look into that some more. But those are, I mean, for the next study, those sound like things that people are interested in looking at. And so to compare the position of Indigenous youth and Francophone youth to the sort of the general population of youth in Niagara.
And just to add to that, Jeff, we've had another comment about youth with a disability as well. So it sounds like there's some subpopulations emerging there that may be worth exploring a bit deeper. Is there any way, Dave has asked, is there any way to obtain qualitative information in the next part of the study about youth in Niagara satisfaction, future plans, et cetera, and that may be a way to get at some of those subpopulations?
That could be. We haven't sort of talked about a budget yet for the project, and so collecting qualitative data is time-consuming in a different way. I think I can imagine some sampling frames, so some ways to sample youth from those three populations. We'd have to kind of look into the cost or budget and how many RAs I get.
Yeah.
And I'm raising that question, Dave, because I'm a big believer in triangulation of qualitative and quantitative data. I mean, the qualitative, like you suggested, would allow us to probe deeper and really understand the perception of the youth with respect to their prospects in the region, why they stay, why they leave, and the like. So that would be certainly a consideration as we move forward.
Great. Tom has asked, is there any business, and this is to you as presenters, but anyone on the phone, are there any businesses that are really leading the way in actively recruiting youth out of post-secondary to help retain them in the Niagara area?
And that's for everybody, not just us, correct?
That's right, yeah.
Well, the one thing I can definitely say to that is over the past 5-6 years, what we've seen is a more sort of systematic and more intentional conversation around internships and co-ops that would build a network amongst the post-secondary institutions and the major employers. So in that regard, I've seen greater intentionality sort of to reach out to the young and help them, if you will, build those critical skill sets after graduation. But I think that we need to build that infrastructure a bit more. We could do better, if you will.
Right.
I mean, anecdotally, I know through our internship program in geography and tourism studies, we have students who go on and do internships at local environmental consulting firms and then go on to take a job there afterwards. But frankly, that's been going on for decades. So that's more of kind of happenstance. I'm not aware of any kind of systematic actual attempts to, like any movement, as Charles said, beyond intentionality. So our discussion, right? So. Right.
Thank you, Dave, for sharing that the Niagara Industrial Association is working at building a network of education and businesses working together. So it's great. It sounds like it would be great to see some leaders kind of emerge across Niagara that are looking at ways to keep youth in the area.
Yeah, I think, again, anecdotally, because I have children of that age, not in university, but in high school, it's difficult, from what I'm gathering, to match kids and their interests with the right businesses. So they're actually working in a capacity that interests them, and that is in their field of study. I think sometimes it's difficult to do that, and I think it's really key that those involved in co-ops and internships, as I think you had mentioned, Charles, really start to focus with greater intention on making sure that a kid coming out of a certain program is working for a company that can use the education that they've received.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And that actually leads nicely into Megan's comment here that it would be interesting to see what programs youth are graduating from and then matching that to the demand that Niagara has for those fields.
Right. I mean, when you see that, back in 2011, they were graduating from the health and related fields, and then that, Niagara is an aging population, then you start to wonder, it came up in a conversation recently, why doesn't Brock have a gerontology program? So it's things like that, those type of conversations that people have to start connecting the dots. And
I mean, I did hear a lecture yesterday in which Reno Mustashi from the region was talking about, based on some work economists have done for them, that they think that a lot of growth locally will be taking place in the caring of elderly. Now, what the sort of wage rates of that happen to be, or the working conditions, that's a different question. So, another thing that I would be interested in exploring in the second paper is the degree to which local firms are actually how effective they are at training entry-level workers and developing sort of firm-based skills, right? So there's been a lot of claims that like universities or colleges or high schools aren't doing enough. But if you look at the sort of large picture data, there's been declines in the last decade, or actually more than the last decade, in sort of workforce training that's been provided by firms to their own employees. So while I get that firms are kind of operating on a knife edge, there has to be some investment by firms once they've identified people that they think are competent and have the basic skill set they need, into then further educating them or further training their workforce so that they're more productive, right?
Well, and putting on for a second my age-friendly hat, working with age-friendly communities and coming back to that comment about our aging population, how can firms and businesses also incorporate either their older workforce or retired workforce for mentorship opportunities to help those new into the workforce, skill up as needed and help with that experience? Claire has asked...
The central story here really boils down to this. In Niagara, what we have is not a lack of human capital. It's not a lack of skill set. What we need to do, essentially, is have a conversation about synchronizing generational skills with the emerging and thriving sectors of our economy. When those two can match, when those two can speak to each other, we'll have a very different experience as a region, right?
Absolutely. And it looks like, Charles, from the poll on the screen here, that there's an interest in all the areas that your team has indicated there, but in particular to look at employment numbers by sector a little bit more deeper. I'm going to, as we continue with the discussion here, I am going to move it on to the next poll to give people time to kind of slot in some of what they're thinking as we're moving through this conversation, and share with us if there's any other specific research topics you would recommend that the team explore. So I'll leave that up as we keep talking. Julia has commented, it's about educating both students and employers about what skills they gain from post-secondary education, and working with local organizations on developing co-op opportunities. We found many employers wanting to have students know everything and can hit the ground running. When we advise them that co-op students will need some training in certain areas, employers feel that our education is then not preparing students adequately.
And I find that a really interesting position, because I don't think 40 years ago people would have thought that. Like, I think 40 years ago firms did more to train their workers. And so there are, like HECO, the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario, I think in 2016 or 2015, published a report in which they talked about the requirements for entry-level positions, and at the entry-level positions wanted things like 3 years of job experience. So that isn't really an entry-level position, right? So,
Right.
so there needs to be some discussion about what's realistic. That if you want somebody with 3 years of experience, then you should probably pay them for having that 3 years of experience and not pay them entry-level wages as well, right? So, and this is not a problem that's unique to Niagara. This is a common problem throughout North America. It's a common problem in part because there's rapid technological change so that often it's hard to figure out, what skill sets should people know to perform a particular job, when in 10 years, like maybe that job doesn't technically exist yet and won't exist for another 5 or 10 years. So that in some ways, education systems being asked to prepare workers, for 5 or 10 or 15 years from now, when even firms don't even know what they're going to need 5 or 10 or 15 years from now. So, I think some of that is just motivated by firms kvetching and hoping to get a free ride. So not to be too snarky about it, but I think that universities and colleges can do more to prepare students for the workforce, but at the same time, it's not a problem that is, purely our making.
Well, I would think that if you're a business and you're partnering in on a co-op, the whole part of co-oping is that you're part of the educational experience.
Right. But I've seen as an internship supervisor over the years, what I've noticed works really well for internships, for our students that do internships, are cases where we put them in a firm or a nonprofit or a government agency in which they are provided mentoring on a daily basis, that people are checking in on them, as opposed to sort of just throwing them to the wolves and saying, do X, Y, and Z for me. That works for some people, but for most of our students that I've seen, and I would imagine this works for most anybody listening, when you're starting out somewhere and you're getting clear sort of guidance or parameters on what they want you to do and what are the expected levels of quality, then that's useful. And I think this kind of gets more generally to an inability of organizations to figure out what do they need to do to train their own workforce, not just at the entry level, but as they kind of move through the system as well, right? And given that firms over the past couple of decades in North America have tended to become smaller, I can understand why there's less ability to kind of deliver this kind of training. But at some point, if you want skilled workers and you're not doing and you're not a law firm or a hospital or some working in some industry in which there are professional associations that set standards and really look forward to future development of that industry and related occupations, in those cases, there are fairly clear kind of job ladders or trajectories. But a lot of jobs don't have that anymore. So that's something, where, either me saying like firms aren't training their workers enough, or, firms saying universities aren't doing enough. Sort of batting that sort of these excuses back and forth only gets us so far. We need some kind of solution, and it sounds as if Dave from the Niagara Industrial Association, if I got the acronym correct, that what he's talking about sounds like that would be one solution forward. Or, are there local attempts, as I think it was Megan had said something along the lines of, bringing in the elderly, the retired, for them to mentor youth on either in a particular occupation or more generally, developing their skills so that the youth in question is, relatively more employable. So.
I really appreciate you, Erika, raising this question. It's a subject that's very close to my heart as an educator, to understand, sort of the mission or the place of the university or college in the modern economy. when we talk about building those sort of soft infrastructure to support the 21st century economy, I think your question is sort of indicative of the kinds of things that we should be doing, which is really build that conveyor belt of skills generation at the macro level, which is what universities do. Of course, we have specialized skills or programs, but for the most part, what we're doing is we're producing graduates with generalized skill sets, hard and soft, to take on the modern economy. But at the micro level, at the firm level, that's where the partnership with employers come in. And so to really design that conveyor belt between post-secondary institutions and the job creators or employers will be pretty critical. And we can learn from other regions. For instance, Kitchener-Waterloo are having similar conversation along the same line, right? So it's really about partnership. To go back to what Jeff was talking about, how do we design those institutions that would allow us to leverage and fully use our human capital?
I have two comments here from participants that touch on the subject of compensation. So Erica shares that with an increase in minimum wage, some employers have already expressed concerns about being able to employ youth and create new opportunities within their business due to the additional costs that will bring to their business. Recruitment for youth will become harder for those coming from post-secondary education or who are in post-secondary looking for internships or co-ops. And then Julia shares, in addition, based on our economy climate, Niagara has disadvantage when it comes to compensation and levels of positions. In order to keep talent in Niagara, it's important for us to be willing to invest in these students, meaning knowledge, opportunities, training, and cultivate these talents early on so that they will be committed to staying in Niagara. So thank you both for those comments. I put an ask out in the chat pod about how participants, how those listening in today feel that this data might help them within their own planning and decision making. And Dave has shared that this data is vital for ensuring a healthy economy and a strong workforce. It's a priority of the regional government. And Claire says data about youth employment will be of deep interest to any decision makers who want to shape public policy to retain youth in Niagara. Great comments.
Yeah, I think we're looking forward. I mean, in a way, we've become data geeks. I think we're looking forward to November 29th when the education data is released by the census, and we can redo the graphs that are in this brief, but with up-to-date numbers, and also now with subgroups in that. I think we'll be looking more closely at the various subgroups to see what's available for free online, but then also what we can get out of Stats Canada as
either a sort of
a customized table,
or through some other channels.
Yeah. So there's some good questions here. Now we know exactly what to look for initially on the 29th, and then what we can start bugging StatsCan for in the next couple of months.
And some additional areas that have been shared here is to look also at immigrant information.
I wrote that down,
Perfect. And also about looking at youth employed in private versus public businesses.
Oh. I don't know if StatsCan divides that up. That might be problematic, but we can ask around. The Workforce Planning Board might know how to differentiate between the two in the numbers. So private versus public.
I mean, I suppose in theory you could use some sort of the Canadian equivalent of like a Freedom of Information request to get that, but that would take ages to actually get that through all of the appropriate organizations.
Right. Tom has asked, are there any public discussions on youth employment? I know there are private discussions via the region, Niagara Workforce Planning Board, and others, but are there any public discussions happening?
I appreciate that question. And I think the thrust of this research ultimately is to demonstrate to our decision makers the need to really design a platform that could have this conversation at the regional level. Once again, as a region, this is a conversation we need to have. It's about synchronizing different facets of our economy, skills generation and their utilization. Right? When those two can sit around the same table, we can talk about mechanisms for fully using what we have as a region. It's not for lack of skills or talent. it's how well we are using them. So once again, what we're producing is information or evidence to demonstrate the need for such a platform to synchronize the activities of the job creators with those that generate the skills in the first place.
I mean, this issue of sort of, we haven't exactly touched on it, but sort of lurking in the background is sort of a variation of brain drain, right? So that Niagara produces a lot of talented, skilled workers who then leave and go to the GTA mainly. And, you know, this is also not a problem that's unique to Niagara. I mean, one of Niagara's saving graces is that we are relatively close to the GTA and to Hamilton, and that, you know, in the coming decades, I would imagine as those areas continue to sort of grow, that growth will spill over, I mean, as we really already see in Grimsby, will slowly spill into the Niagara region, right? Now, that doesn't do anything for people who are, you know, looking for a job right now. But I guess my point is that what we're seeing is not just a Niagara-specific problem. This is a problem throughout, not even North America, throughout the world. So that places that are sort of in secondary sites in the national economy lose people to larger metropolitan economies. So we have to also recognize that whatever we do, we're still probably going to lose people, you know, to the degree that we can do anything in a democratic society. This isn't, you know, the Soviet Union or the People's Republic of China, in which we have internal passports and we can say, okay, you don't have, you know, a permit to relocate to some other location, so you must pick a job in Niagara, right? So I mean, these part of the problems that we're seeing are in which then people say, oh, we should do something about it. We have to recognize that to some degree our hands are tied, right? So if we want to continue to live in a democratic system.
Right.
But I think for
go
places
ahead.
where there's better integration of youth, or somewhat better, so if we look at some of the Scandinavian economies or the German economy, those systems tend to have stronger sort of, you know, connections between education and the local needs of the local economy. But whether you can achieve that in Ontario or anywhere in North America more generally is, you know, kind of gets to an issue of culture. But I think the way forward is to come up with some kind of solution in which there's a discussion between employers who, you know, are serious about training their workers once they get, you know, minimally competent workers, and in education institutions to help maintain that. I mean, if we go back to the issue of the sort of $15 minimum wage, if most of our economy consists of jobs that are, you know, that are minimum wage jobs anyways, which I don't believe it does. I'd have to look at the data again, but in that case, if a big chunk of the economy it basically employs people in minimum wage jobs, there's no way to increase productivity in those firms so that they could then pay higher wages. You know, we're going to continue to lose people as well. So, I mean, I think some sectors, some industries are probably more amenable to attracting people than others are. So it's kind of a difficult conversation to have, because then I think people in some industries feel attacked as a result of that, right?
And I think this last question is really critical for our next steps, because what the NCO intends to do in the near future, beyond simply probing deeper into the data that's coming out in about 2 weeks, we also want to look at other regions, especially mid-sized regions, you know, Kitchener-Waterloo, Hamilton, and others like Niagara, to get a sense of what they're doing differently or better, and to draw those lessons from those regions to engage a conversation domestically here in Niagara, right? So we're hoping to move beyond simply the data to actually looking at other regions, drawing case studies and lessons to inform local policy design.
Yeah, overall, what's interesting is that the International Labor Organization writes a youth employment report every year, and it has said that the best youth employment strategy is a general employment strategy. So if we want to keep youth here and get them in jobs that they're engaged with and they can build their career, it's not just about them, it's about building the economy in general in Niagara. And and it's all about job creation, and it's all about attracting the right type of companies to come here and set up shop and to get the Niagara SMEs growing and more productive. And all this all works together, right? So.
Okay. As a final maybe question here, we have a comment from Claire that if youth live in Niagara but do commute to another adjoining region to work, Hamilton, Guelph, would we still consider that a win for Niagara?
Yeah, that's a question that came up yesterday at the Workforce Planning Board's presentation on migration, because they didn't quite have the numbers for that. People are coming in and out of Niagara, they're moving in and out, but where are they working? And so we need to look at the commuter flows. And so once we do look at the commuter flows, or once the Workforce Planning Board looks at commuter flows, what does that mean? Because we all know anecdotally people who live in Niagara and commute outside Niagara for their jobs. So that's the question. Is that good or bad? Is it good to be a bedroom community?
I mean, in terms of municipal tax base, I don't see that as a bad thing, because you have people that are, at least they're employed, they're probably making more money doing whatever they're doing than they would in Niagara, and they're buying a lot of goods and services locally, right? So they're paying property taxes locally, they're probably buying groceries locally, they're probably getting their hair cut locally, their kids go to school locally, so they're buying school supplies for their kids. So if we think about the kind of, the sort of spillover effects of that, I think that's not a bad thing. And, again, we're, in an open economy in which, people have the right to move, and I don't see that as necessarily, I don't see that as a bad thing. And in particular, I don't see, the problem with bedroom communities is there can be social problems around them. But there can be social problems around any community, right? So the fact of the matter is that if somebody's making more money commuting out of Niagara than if they stayed in Niagara, and they feel more fulfilled in their own job and they have more opportunities for advancement, then more power to them, I would say. That's what I've got a daughter here. She's 8 now. In about 10 years, she's going to figure out, where she wants to go after that. And I'd love for her to stick around, but, it might be that she wants to specialize in something where there's little demand for that in Niagara, and she needs to move somewhere else, and that's part of living in the 21st century. So.
Right.
Of course, it goes without question that the ideal or the best case scenario would be to have the best and the brightest, not just living here, but also working here.
Yeah.
It goes back to the issue of market efficiencies. The higher the skill set within your local economy, the better for the productivity of your economy. But again, if you have a situation where at least they stay here even though they work somewhere else, well, like Jeff just said, at least they live here, right?
Yeah. That's better than them moving somewhere else and then still working somewhere else. So.
Okay. Well, thank you. That brings us just to 2 o'clock here. What a discussion today. Thank you to everybody who participated, who joined us today and participated in the discussion. We really appreciate it. I love to see that type of exchange happening, and I know that our presenters will go away with lots of things to think about in terms of their next steps going forward and what the possibilities are, and where there are some gaps that we maybe need some more data or information to help inform next steps. So thank you to Charles and Carol and Jeff for your presentation today and for manning those hot questions coming in. And as I said at the beginning, we do record our webinars, so we'll send everybody out a link, resource package in about a week with a link to the recording, a PDF of the slides, and the brief itself. But if you're itching to see the brief now, I saw that Sarah has put up a link to it in the chat pod on the left-hand side of your screen. And she's also put a link up there to get connected with Niagara Connects. If you're not already on our distribution list, I encourage you to do so. We send out invitations for future webinars such as this one through that list, and we also send out a weekly e-newsletter that highlights content that's been added to the Niagara Knowledge Exchange within the past week, and that includes events across the community, resources, new partners, and community blogs as well. So there's lots in there, and it crosses all 12 sectors of our Living in Niagara report, which our newest report is also being released in a couple weeks. So there's a lot happening. There's lots of information out there to inform your work. So please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us if you have any further questions. And without further ado, then, we'll say goodbye there and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Hello. Hi, man.